And she's coming to get the keys from me. I'll be like 90 seconds.
Sorry, I've just started recording again. I've just switched it back on. And what were you asking me, Anne? Sorry.
Can you just bring people in? Because I've just got to pop downstairs and find a door key for my daughter who's locked herself out.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And maybe Roger might like to elaborate a bit on the massive campaign against China, which I hear people even in our group falling for.
Falling for.
Well, they're talking about it's a state that persecutes its minorities, unlike the United States, of course, which does not. So maybe, Roger, you could speak a little bit about how we can combat this and how to deal with these accusations about China.
Yeah,
I'll be back in 1 second.
Just before that, I've just had a message through to say that Donald Trump's been found guilty of sexually abusing the rights of Jean Carroll. So interesting times. Maybe the law does kind of sometimes apply properly. So China's a whole meeting on its own, really, because there's a massive debate about to some people about whether or not it's a socialist or communist country in the first place. For me, I don't really. I spend more time looking at what people actually do, and it seems to me any country that can take so many people, so many millions, the biggest number of people out of poverty in history, in the time that it's done it, they need some respect, frankly, because when I look at countries like the US, and you go to the US and you see the state of that country, and the infrastructure, the cheek that they have to talk about human rights, when I see the way that many of my friends can't walk down the street at night or in the day without fear of being shot at, where the young guy on a tube station, on a metro station in New York last week, just beaten to death because he had the audacity to say that he was hungry and he was homeless, and I think any country that kind of wants to start throwing accusations at other people about what they're doing really needs to be in a better shape to do it than the United States definitely is. And of course, this country, I've suffered enough racism in this country to know about the racism here as well. I'm sure things are not perfect in China because they're not perfect anywhere. But what we do, I think, is we look at ways of working to improve things. And one of the ways you don't improve things, in my view, is you don't do that at the point of a gun. I just don't, we have to break down this military industrial complex that rules everything in the US and is actually guiding their relationships. It's going to be at play in their relationship at some point. The Chinese are convinced as well. The military option will be brought into play in some way, and whether it's by another proxy war, this time in Taiwan, I don't know. But this is what the Chinese certainly believe is going to happen.
Right. Is that optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm an Aston Villa fan, so I have to be optimistic, really, about everything in life. And also, I'm a socialist as well, so I have to be optimistic. But it's always guided by the fact that I'm also an organizer, and in the end, there's no easy way out in these things. It's always about the hard graft of going out and organizing. Always, you've always got to go out. And it's as simple as I mentioned earlier on, going out and having the conversations with people who don't currently agree with us, and turning people towards agreeing with us. Even if we get one more than we had the day before, then that's a success, it seems to me. It applies to China, as it applies to Cuba, as it applies to Nicaragua and Venezuela. These countries are trying to do something, and I think we have to work hard, as you are doing, I know, as other Cuba solidarity groups are doing throughout the country, of just going out and trying to make sure, being there when people have their questions, answering them straightforwardly, just trying to tell the truth about what is actually happening to people. Sometimes people don't want to hear the truth, though, as you will all know. Sometimes people are not comfortable with the truth because they're fed this line continually about what is actually happening through the media and so on. And we have to try and find our way of bypassing that somehow. And the best way I found, as somebody who was a union organizer for 30 years or so, is to just go out and talk with people. Long, hard, but no shortcut, I don't think.
Anybody else would like to make a comment or make a contribution?
Yes,
Yes,
I would. Yes, Roger. I would say that Cuba has always punched above its weight in international affairs. I mean, it's a tiny country, really, only 11 or 12 million population in a world population of, what, 8 billion or something like that. And yet, over the years, it has done so much. One can think about Cuba's role in Southern Africa in the 1960s and 70s, and how they when Angola became independent, they saved it from being taken over by Kissinger and Mobutu in the north and by the South Africans in the south, and they stayed there for 10 years or no, for nearly 15 years. They kept the troops there, and then they finally defeated South Africa at Kuta Kanavale, which then brought liberation to Southwest Africa, became Namibia, and ultimately the fall of apartheid. I'm just wondering how you see Cuba punching above its weight these days. I mean, one thing that this Dr. Rodriguez is part of, I think, is the Cuban Institute for Foreign Relations, which is an interesting institution in itself. I think it's a kind of school for diplomats, as I understand it, and it's a very high-powered higher education institute, and that's one thing. But also maybe you could mention about Cuba being the current chair of the G77 plus China, which is obviously a great honor to a small country like Cuba.
I mean, I'm getting feedback. All of those things are absolutely vital. I mean, I think one of the things that often gets talked about is the military support that Cuba's given a lot of liberation struggles, and that's really important for certain. But I think what often gets overlooked is and maybe this is about punching above your weight, but it's the inspiration that it gives to so many people in the world, what it gives to people of African descent, in terms of I'm trying to find a way of explaining this. When you are constantly being told that you are second class, when you are constantly insulted, when you are trying to find a way of saying, I am a woman, I am a man, I am a human being, and I have a contribution to make. When people are saying that you're none of those things, that you are worse than anything, you know, you're something that I trample on, because that's how many of us have been treated over the years. You need to be able to look to somebody somewhere that has not accepted that and has been able to stand up and defeat it. So what I would say is that it's one of the things that many of us look at in terms of the Haitian Revolution as well. The first country to become a nation having defeated slavery. Massive inspiration, which is one of the reasons why the US and its allies crush it at every opportunity. And why it's now, despite all the resources that it has, it's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. But we've got Cuba still standing up, still fighting, but also playing that role on the international stage that isn't just about fighting. It's not just about how much military kind of equipment that you have, but it's almost I don't know if I'm overdoing this really, but there's almost this kind of moral strength that we can kind of draw on that for me is much more than people who are able to brandish how many guns that they've got. There's something else there. And when you are when you talk to other progressive people, socialists, communists, whatever, across the Caribbean in particular, they draw massive inspiration still to this day from Cuba, and the bilateral relations that many of these countries have with Cuba is improving. And I think it's improving because I think many of those countries, again, see that the being treated as being in somebody else's backyard is pretty insulting to anybody, and that there needs to be a breakout from all of that. Now, of course, there are some really right-wing governments in the Caribbean. There are governments that still, really oppose Cuba politically. But what I see in the work that I do every day, when I have to go through the news from across the world, and I have to see who's meeting who, and what has happened where, I'm seeing better relations taking place with Cuba. I look at Cuba Radio every day, the website Cuba Radio, and the news on there talks about the meetings that take place every day as a matter of routine between Cuba and other governments across the Caribbean. In the same way that over here, we would have, just as a matter of course, France meets the UK, France meets Germany, Belgium, whatever. It's natural. Those meetings are natural. But I think what's happening is the terms on which those meetings are taking place are now developing a better substance because, you know, I mean, Cuba's, you know, chairing the G77 and so on. You know, I think that's a massive step, and it goes alongside a lot of the other kind of groupings that are taking place away from the G7. And when you look at the G7 and you look at, I saw a picture of the G7 meeting, G7, you know, kind of heads of government meeting. So it's basically all the colonial powers, the old colonial powers sitting around the table. And then you look at a picture of the G77, not the colonial powers who are meeting around the table. That is massively significant, massively significant. So for Cuba to be chairing that at the moment, but more importantly, the leadership that it can give to that movement of independence for the global South, I just think it is. You asked me earlier on about whether I'm optimistic or not. That's something that gives me optimism. Really does give me optimism. When I see just a pictorial evidence of something like that, and you just look at it and you just think, yeah, that's quite stark actually. That's the old world. This is the new world. And I think we have to hang on to that kind of you know, just way of looking at things. I can't remember who said that. Somebody will be able to tell me that, you know, the old world is screaming when it's kind of dying or something. I can't remember who it was. I've got the quote completely wrong, but somebody said something about how the old world screams when it's dying. You know, do you know who it is, Pauline? Can't hear you.
I was putting my hand up basically because I wanted to ask you a question, but before that, it's I know exactly. I know the quote you're thinking of, and it's something about the new world is waiting to be born.
That's the one.
Something about the old world, and the new world is waiting to be born. Yeah. I was going to ask you another thing about maybe to do with the new world being born, that Cuba has, you know, obviously one great admiration for the way that they have stood up militarily in southern Africa to help in the part they played, the crucial role they played in the defeat of apartheid in South Africa and the liberation of the former Portuguese colonies, etc. But the other aspect is that Cuba can never do anything right in the eyes of the US. They can't do anything right. They're vilified for freeing countries from colonial rule. They're also vilified for stepping in to act as a negotiator for the Colombians, and that's why they are still on the list of states that support terrorism or whatever it is, because they've been trying to broker a peace deal between FARC and the government, and thank goodness we've now got a president in Colombia who is actually taking this stuff on board. So I don't know whether you'd like to make a comment or two about that, please.
I mean, one comment I will make is that I think we shouldn't completely take away the agency of people on the ground who are not Cubans in some of these revolutions, in some of these acts of resistance. So Cuba's role was massively helpful. Thanks, Leslie, for that. Cuba's role was massive and perhaps decisive. But remember, it's really worth remembering, of course, is that people, you know, locally played, you know, without them, it doesn't happen. You know, so people in like Mozambique and and the people who fought against apartheid, the South Africans who fought against apartheid, absolutely vital to have the support of the Cubans, but it's the people on the ground, local people who led those fights, and I think it's really important to remember that. I do agree with you, Pauline, though, that it doesn't matter if what Cuba does in terms of the United States. Frankly, for the United States, it doesn't matter what anybody who's got socialist intentions has and wants to do. They will be seen as not with the United States. But it just seemed to me to be quite a peculiar thing that people who try and find a peaceful solution to conflict are vilified. It's of course happening to China, as China came up with its peace proposals for the Ukraine conflict. The US were really pissed off with China for bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together. They simply didn't know that was happening. Because that was going to, and of course that, and they said that, they've said that openly. We didn't know about this, and of course that's ending a conflict that the US had a primary hand in Yemen, and they didn't know that somebody was trying to stop that, right? So they are really keen not to allow that to happen again. It's quite useful for the arms manufacturers in the United States to have a place where their weapons can be used. Frankly, that might sound very kind of blunt about it, but frankly, I think that is what happens. Thank God for people, if you believe in a God, like for countries like Cuba, who want to bring peace. And again, I think our job is to do whatever we can to help them in their task. What I think we should never underestimate, and I'm not suggesting anybody on this call is, but I think that that there's going to be a fight back from the far right across Latin America. We started to see it in the last few days in Chile. The constitutional elections that took place on Sunday, the far right won massively. In second place was We Couldn't Be Asked, really. Not to put too fine a point, 26% of Chilean electorate, and it's compulsory to vote there, didn't vote. 26%, that's huge, right? And Boric, who is not really delivering on a lot of the things that he said he was going to, is having some real problems there, and it's bolstered up the far right, and it will give inspiration to the far right in other parts of Latin America, who have already made use of this lawfare to be able to bring charges against people so that they can't stand in elections, and so on. And we're going to see more of that. I mean, obviously Lula and others were kind of the most famously, I guess, that was used against, but we're going to see it again. And I think what the role Cuba has to play is keep taking the moral high ground, is keep pushing the need for better healthcare, better education across the region, being prepared to work with other nations to help to deliver those things. If that means some of the teachers, some of the doctors that it's trained going elsewhere, that's the sort of help situation I think that we're in with Cuba now. It's not necessarily going to be military help for people, rich history of that support, but I think the support that is going to be really helpful now, as we've seen this pink tide sweep across Latin America, is maintaining it. And I think the way that is to be maintained really needs to be by prioritizing education and healthcare in particular, to give people a chance to survive and give people a chance to learn and give people a chance to contribute and build a better life for themselves, but also a better society. And Cuba can help people to do that. So maybe there's, I suppose what I'm saying is there's a new type of assistance that Cuba can be giving, rich history of the military where it's been needed. And I dare say if it was ever needed again, Cuba would be there for people. But now maybe it's about that next phase of helping to consolidate some of the progressive nations. I wouldn't call all of them socialists, but some of the progressive politics that exists across Latin America now, maybe.
Thank you, Roger. Can I just ask Juan if he'd like? Juan is from Chile. Would you like to comment on the situation?
Yeah, I mean, it was very depressing, wasn't it? What happened on Sunday? I mean, I think a lot of it is the fault of political communication. I mean, that was certainly the case with when we had the referendum on the new constitution. It was actually because when there wasn't mandatory voting, it was passed that there would be a new constitution. Then mandatory voting came in, and there was, I think there's something like 65% partook in the first to do a constitution, and then obviously everyone had to participate in the granting or rejecting it. And I think that there wasn't any communication about what that could bring. I mean, I think it's worth looking back at the plebiscite in 1985, which was about the not 1985, it was, or 1987, basically about whether he should stay or not. And actually, it was a real education on what you could do in terms of communication, because what the No campaign, which was no, we don't want Pinochet, did is it gave hope, and it said this is what we could achieve, rather than a kind of a really rejectionist kind of campaign. And basically, there was no campaign on the left. The left kind of thought, well, we got Boric in, we've done our job. And you never, as I think you quite rightly said, Roger, is that the work is never done, isn't it? And I don't think the Chilean nation is a right-wing nation, because the thing is, it's the extreme right-wing one and the quite extreme right-wing one. So it wasn't even a kind of just tepid right-wing. These are real Bolsonaro fanatics. But I think the left have got to make a case for why socialism is worth going for. And unless we make that case, then the status quo stays. So I agree with you, Rogers, that we do have to have those conversations and try and amplify them as much as we can, because, Latin America has been plagued, hasn't it, with these certain pink and sometimes red tides, but they don't come in for long. The tide doesn't stay in for very long, really. So yeah, no real answers, I'm afraid. We've got to be there to make the arguments.
I think that's great, and it seems to me that one of the things that I learned about Cuba, for me, is the amount of conversations that actually take place in the country. Because people say often, well, Cuba's this dictatorship and nobody has a say, and it's all done through this, one person has a say and all that stuff. But actually, anybody who knows anything about Cuba knows about all the conversations that have to take place all over the island. And when I first started learning about this stuff, I thought, this can't be right. You're really going to have this? How the hell does that work? And then so I started to just study it. And actually, it's the same for lots of conversations take place around China as well. Interestingly, just to be able to get to the central kind of parliament, whatever they're called in each of the countries, the different names for them, but to be able to just get to that point, you have to go through so many conversations, so many elections just to get to there before you can have another. You know, it's quite a remarkable exercise in democracy. But for me, it's what you were saying, Juan, about the need for those conversations, to talk about the need for socialism, because I think that you know, it's a hard conversation to have when people are telling you all the time, well, there ain't a need for it, and by the way, it's evil anyway, so why are you even bothering to think about talking about it, never mind talking about it, right? Well, actually, let's talk about what it is. And then you get to one of the difficulties that I think was maybe a problem with the constitutional discussions in Chile on Sunday, is that when you're talking about a whole, when you start talking about a whole raft of things, there's always going to be something in there that people will disagree with, heartily disagree with. So they'll not vote for the whole thing because there's something in there that they fundamentally kind of can't stand, you know, the notion of. It's actually part of the discussion that I had with the Nicaraguan minister today was about how he was saying that they were you know, they were promoting the idea of discussions across the whole country to talk about the way that the education system could be developed, and the way that teachers can be trained, because up until recently, most teachers in Nicaragua were not trained. They were just people who thought, well, it's a good idea to go out and, you know, kind of pass on knowledge about how to read and write to people. So they had to go through a whole process of training people, you know, and make it, you know, so something like now, it's like you said, 98% of people who teach in schools are trained teachers, whereas it was completely the opposite about 10 years ago or something. So they really made an effort, but you don't just do that. You can't just introduce that, because people just get really pissed off if you just try and just introduce something and say, from now on, you know, Ortega, as the dictator that I am, I'm going to tell you all that this is what we, you know, it just won't work. So you have to have the conversations and let people feel that they own some of this stuff, and that's what they're doing. I think it's what people in Cuba do. So people don't feel it's a revolution that's done to them. I think people in Cuba think that it's their revolution, and I think that just makes such a difference. If you know, and it's maybe one of the things that happened with the Soviet Union, that over years that people felt it was being done to them, rather than it was, as I'm certain it started out as something that was theirs, that you know, they won against the Tsar and so on. So I think there's you can never have too many conversations, but at some time you have to have a decision-making process, and I think Cuba does that really well. I think they found a really nice balance around that. And I think China does that pretty well. But I think a lot of countries don't do that. But also an understanding that these discussions are never ended, because you're always learning from, well, how did we in Cuba get through the pandemic? Is there anything that we can learn from that? Well, yes, there is, because we need to improve our infrastructure around, you know, some of our medical infrastructure, but we can only do that if we can get access to some of these materials. So we need to find a way of being able to do that. The way of being able to do that is to have a different access to finance that doesn't rely on the US being able to stop us. And that's where I started at the beginning. It is so important that if you want to improve, if Cuba really wants to improve its position economically, socially, then it has to find a different way of being able to finance those things, because the finance to all of those avenues is cut off by the United States sanctions at the minute. So the access to the SUR, if it happens, is going to be really interesting. But also the fact that if people are trading in anything other than dollars, you know, they're not part of the SWIFT system that the United States controls, which allows them to sanction anybody at will. If they can find a different way of trading with people, sanctions don't matter. All right, they'll not have the ability to be able to trade with one of somebody 90 miles away who's massive, towering over them, but they will have access to trade with China and with the whole of Africa, and who are looking for people to trade with, and India. Now, just the countries that I've mentioned, that's pretty much the entire world population. Just those few, that's a massive population. So if you can do something like that, that makes a massive difference. And again, where's my optimism come from? Because I see something really happening with that financial switch. And if that happens, Cuba has a real chance of breaking away from this sanctions regime. Really does. And that's something to plan for. And I think they're starting to plan for that. And so it's not just well, we're going to be able to trade. What the hell do we do now? It's, well, what are we going to do? What's the priorities? Well, priority in Cuba, education, health, as it's always been. Well, we'll be able to be even better than we are now, but also we'll be able to make sure that people have the food that they need, the equipment that they need, the oil, because it won't be traded in dollars anymore. People will be able to put fuel in those bloody horrible cars that they've got.
Roger, I think that's a really good way to end. Sorry we've got to end, but it's lovely to end on that amazingly optimistic note from you. I mean, I always think Cuba's probably lucky because all its exploiters all went off to Miami. So, it kicked out, or they left. Sadly, a lot of countries in Latin America are left with them. But, I think it's good that you've shown a way that, things can be fought for, not with guns, but with ideals and with humanity. So thank you so much.
No, thank you all so much. It's been a real pleasure to meet you all. And honestly, if I haven't pissed you all off so much, invite me down for a in-person meeting sometime, and hopefully I can.
Oh, that would be absolutely lovely. And we look forward to your columns. We look forward to tomorrow's Morning Star avidly. And having put a personality to your journalism is brilliant. So it's really personal now.
Thanks very much, Roger.
Again.
No problem.
Thanks everyone else.